If you understood where you were spending your time, you'd spend it with a lot more leverage. And the statistic that I always harken back to is the average knowledge worker works on average 9 hours a day and only adds value for 3. When we talk about our mission of returning time, that is really what we're in the business of doing over the next decade or two, is helping people understand what are the 3-4 hours a day that really matter and hyper-focusing there. And then what are the 5 to 6 hours a day that we call the theater of work? How do we expose that and just get that off people's plates?
Welcome to Building with AI, the show where we engage in conversations with world-class business leaders and AI. Our goal is to uncover tactical advice to help you build and scale better AI products. I'm your host, Haroon Choudery, and today I have the pleasure of being here with Ryan Alshak, CEO of Laurel, an AI-powered timekeeping software for professional services. During our conversation, Ryan elaborates on how his experience as a lawyer made him realize the inefficiencies with traditional timekeeping and inspired him to start Laurel. Ryan also delves into Laurel's expansion into new domains, his North Star of allowing people to focus on meaningful work, AI strategy, and much, much more. Before we dig in, here's a quick word from our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Autoblocks, the AI optimization platform product teams use to create world-class AI experiences. So, you just launched V0 of your AI feature or product. What's next? Autoblocks unlocks an intuitive yet powerful optimization workflow that helps you continuously understand, improve, differentiate your AI-powered products. Understand how your users interact with your product by connecting user activity to what's happening under the hood of your application. Improve your product thoughtfully and iteratively. Integrate testing of your AI products into your CI workflow and run A/B tests to see what changes are driving great user outcomes. Differentiate your AI products with powerful fine-tuning workflow that lets you turn product usage data into training data. Get started with Autoblocks for free at autoblocks.ai. Now, back to the episode. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So for those that don't know you, don't know about Laurel, do you mind giving an intro about yourself and the journey leading up to the startup, and then also a little bit about the startup itself?
Of course. So Ryan Alshak started the company about 5 years ago, and I was a lawyer on a Monday. I would just block off from 3 to 5. And I was sitting there and I was just like, how stupid is it that I'm reminding a digital system what I did at work when the digital system should be reminding me? And I was billing out at $650 an hour and ostensibly making up my time. And I was pretty convinced that was not how the future of time would be kept. And I started going around my firm and asking other lawyers how they did their time. And I was shocked to hear that they pretty much all made it up. Or they would have these timers on their desk. And so these equity partners would literally clock in, clock out, clock in, clock out. And I figured that there was going to be someone that developed a better solution and teamed up with people much smarter than myself. And Laurel has been applying AI to automate the timesheet process. And so the real question that we are trying to answer is, how can a machine more effectively and efficiently keep time than a human?
Beautiful. And you mentioned you started around 5 years ago?
Correct.
I'm curious, was AI a part of the original vision 5 years ago? And if it was, what's been the evolution of Laurel over time and some of the technologies that are powering this more automated timekeeping workflow?
Originally, when I set out to start the business, I did not set out to start an AI business. What I set out to is solve the customer pain point of keeping time. And then as we developed the solution, it turns out that the only way for a machine to, again, do it more effectively and efficiently than a human is to apply intelligent systems to be able to make sense of how time is done. A lawyer, an accountant, a consultant will engage with between 200 and 300 distinct activities in a given day. You're jumping between email, you're jumping between different URLs, between Slack, between Zoom. And by presenting everything that a professional did, turns out that a professional is overwhelmed and they end up saying, I'm just going to do my time manually because it's faster for me to do that. So one of the key AI applications we have to develop is, okay, how do we group or cluster this data in an intelligent way such that the work represents how a human thinks about time? And so we can go the entire sort of stack there, but I think the TLDR is that we did not set out to start an AI company, but realized that we had to leverage AI to solve the customer pain point of keeping time.
And the legal space was your beachhead. That was the beachhead industry that you went after. But were there any other tailwinds that pushed you to pursue that space? What are some other industries where timekeeping is maybe as essential as the legal space?
Yeah, so it was always the vision to start with law and then expand into other time-based industries. And then eventually the vision of the company is to expand into non-time-based industries. If you solve it for law, then you'll be able to solve it for anybody else. And for those that are fans of different incarceration podcasts, you know that the prison yard theory is that you pick a fight with the biggest, baddest guy in the yard. And then basically if you win, then everyone knows not to mess with you. And so that is the legal industry for us. And then in terms of other industries in which was always the vision, accounting, consulting, any professional services that keep time, those are the very natural extensions. But what gets me very excited about the business, and we can talk about the vision of it, is every digital worker needs to understand where their time is going, whether or not you bill for it. And so if we solve this for professional services and the existing workflow that exists, and we really develop the AI and the data loop to get to a place where it's fully automating timesheets, then every knowledge worker will want to understand where their time is actually going. With the thesis being that if you understood where you were spending your time, you'd spend it with a lot more leverage. And the statistic that I always harken back to is the average knowledge worker, which you and I are, works on average 9 hours a day and only adds value for 3. When we talk about our mission of returning time, that is really what we're in the business of doing over the next decade or two, is helping people understand what are the 3-4 hours a day that really matter and hyper-focusing there. And then what are the 5 to 6 hours a day that we call the theater of work? How do we expose that and just get that off people's plates?
That's fascinating. And do you have any metrics regarding your customers and the time that they've been able to save, or maybe the productivity gains that Laurel has been able to lend to?
Yeah. So again, right now we are only active in law and accounting. What we sell is money, time, and data. So on the money side, because we are automatically capturing a knowledge worker's work, they are billing anywhere between 4 and 11% more time. So that is massive revenue generation for our clients. And you can imagine there, as a lawyer or an accountant, it is impossible to remember every email that you sent, every phone call that you took, every research that you did. And so the system is automatically allowing you to recollect that time. So that's the money side. Then on the time side, keeping time is a non-chargeable, non-billable action. So in a very meta way, as a lawyer, I would spend 2 hours a week keeping time. Time that I did not get credit for, time that was my own sort of admin. And right now we are reducing that by about half. The goal is eventually for that to be 0. And then on the data side, what we've definitively proven is that when a machine is doing time on behalf of a human, that machine is doing that time more accurately, more structured, and allows us to aggregate that data. And so we are collecting a time data set that has never been created before. And that really sets up the second phase of the business, which obviously I'm sure we'll get into.
So part of your business, it seems like it's reliant on having access and intelligence into what users are actually doing. And so integrations become very instrumental to a business like Laurel's. How have you approached the integrations piece? And for context, we had a conversation with Dan Soroper at Rewind a few weeks ago, and they have their own approach to tracking exactly what users are doing, with the value prop being that they can make it much easier and much more convenient for people to understand what they did in the past, have a AI-powered memory bank, I guess you could call it. So how is Laurel integrating with some of these tools that folks in the legal profession or accounting profession they're using on a daily basis?
Yeah, a couple ways to answer that. First, it's important to realize that we are dealing with more antiquated industries. And so Rewind is a fantastic company. And their sort of ICP are people that use M1, M2 silicon chips. And so they're able to do a lot of on-device processing and then index that data. Unfortunately, as much as we'd love to do that, our users are using machines that are not nearly as powerful. And so for our integration strategy, we had to go application by application to get the level of data that we needed. I think of the application in 4 distinct buckets. First, you have to capture the entire digital footprint of a professional. And then you have to layer on AI to make that digital footprint make intuitive sense to a user. Then you have to visualize it on a user experience that allows for that human in the loop. And then you have to build an integration to make sure that it sits and feeds into the firm's billing system and then ultimately gets to a client as quickly and accurately as possible. So on the tracking side, What we've done is all of our users are on Windows machines, and we are tracking any executable on a desktop machine. So you can think Outlook Calendar, Outlook Email, your Microsoft Suite, your PDFs of the world, your web-based activity, any executable, we're able to track at a very granular layer. And then we mirror that with our cloud-based assistants. And those are device agnostic. So for those, you can think of Zoom, you can think of Teams, you can think of Microsoft's O365, you can think of Cisco. And so then we're capturing all of that. And the reason why the integrations are so important is because they create real defensibility for what we are doing. On the other are companies that are creating proprietary data sets and are doing so in a unique way. And not only do you have to create the data set, but you have to do so in a way where somebody else cannot also create it. Otherwise, the marginal value will be zero. And so there you're looking for companies that have real barrier to entry or real technology moats around the AI itself. And then in the middle, there's a bunch of sort of people just building GUIs on top of open source LLMs, which are really interesting from a 0 to 1 standpoint to identify pain points, but ultimately don't have enough defensibility to create real enterprise value. And we look at our integrations and all the pieces around our compliance and InfoSec side as real defensibility as to why it'd be very difficult to catch us from behind.
A tremendous amount of sense. And you mentioned data sets as being one of the core competitive advantages that companies can build. What exactly does that look like? How are those data sets leveraged as a competitive advantage or to continue the trend of using overplayed terms and words in the AI space?
The micro answer is how it allows your product to get smarter over time. So that's the initial one, right? This is the human in the loop, and this is the compounding advantage in the network effect of AI. The more users that are using it, the more that they are correcting the AI in a nonlinear way, the more accurate the AI, the more users you get, so on and so forth. That's the flywheel. That's pretty obvious, and we can talk about how we do that for Laurel, the product itself. But just as interesting, actually, for me, and more interesting, is also what are the data sets that you're creating for future products and future LLM training? And for us, because our AI runs on the work itself to analyze an email, analyze a document, analyze a contract, well, we are collecting that corpus of data, and in the future can look to automate a lot of the lower leverage tasks that a knowledge worker takes on. And so when we think about actually solving this problem of 3 hours of leverage, 6 hours of non-leverage, it's not that the 6 hours of work doesn't need to get done. It just doesn't need to get done by a human. But you need to have enough data there to be able to automate. And there, I think we have a really interesting wedge using time to collect the corpus of data to automate work at scale. And the company analogy that I really love here is that Netflix started with a mail DVD business. It's just a better mousetrap in terms of distribution. But they used that as R&D to understand streaming, right? And user preferences and recommendations. And that sort of phase 2 of the business ended up cannibalizing their phase 1. And I think a lot about what we do here in terms of time. If we really do our job right, our data side of the house will eventually cannibalize the need to keep time in the way that it's being done today.
When talking about a Netflix, having that physical mail-in DVD model allowed them to get a head start in building that recommendation engine, as you mentioned. And now that's one of the things their team is world-class and renowned for. Completely makes sense. Okay, so Ryan, I'm curious to learn a little bit more about why this mission in particular is of importance to you. Where does that passion come from?
I really wanted to solve this pain point of keeping time because I felt it dehumanizing to reduce people's value to minutes and asking them to track it. And that's not how we should work. After about 6 months of starting the company, my mom's brain cancer had come back. And so I ended up moving back home, like every 30-year-old loves to do. And I ended up taking care of her day in and day out while we built the company. And a month after we raised our seed round, which was the first institutional money that we raised, she ended up passing. And I sat with this question of, okay, I'm building this and I just lost all of this. I realized in that year and a half that time is the only asset worth protecting, and that those minutes with her at the end were worth 1,000,000 minutes doing anything else. And I realized that the problem set that I actually cared about wasn't helping lawyers keep time or accountants keep time faster. It was allowing humans to take that time and spend it on things that bring them a lot more joy and happiness and hopefully love. And I think of how much time we collectively waste as a society, how cavalier we are about our time, how all this software and advisors and tooling and industry exists around tracking our dollars, and yet really nothing exists around tracking our minutes. And every person at the company, it's the thing I am most proud of, joins the company because they want to work on the problem set of time. And a mission is really only a sort of connective tissue across an organization to keep going when any other rational person would stop. And people ask me all the time, why will Laurel be the one to solve this large problem around understanding how people work? And the answer that I give is because we won't stop. It's not the AI, it's not the go-to-market, it's not the UX, it's not anything else. It's just simply the tenacity and the grit, because we really care about this problem at a very visceral level.
Wow, that's so powerful. And thank you so much for sharing and for being vulnerable. Now it makes a ton of sense why you're very passionate about this business. So just to shift gears, how did you interpret all of the noise being made around ChatGPT and way before that, ChatGPT 2 and ChatGPT 3? When those were released, how did you first discover those technologies? And I'm curious what the progression was in the conversations as to whether that technology could be leveraged in Laurel and then eventually the implementation of that technology into the product.
Yeah, what was great about what we were doing is we had already identified customer pain points in which we needed AI to solve. Before I get into sort of the GenAI side and what changed for us, it would probably help to talk about how we actually apply AI to what we're.
Perfect.
So the first thing that we do, and we touched on this, is how do you turn, on average, 250 sort of work fragments into groups of work that make sense to you as a user? That's the sort of layman's way of describing the customer pain point. And well, we can get into how we do that, but just that's the first piece. Then the second piece is, okay, now that you have these groups, who does the work belong to? And a lawyer would call this a client or matter. An accountant would call this a project and engagement. We at Laurel call this an OKR. Doesn't really matter what the ontology is. It just says, who is it that I'm working for? Who's my client, if you will? So that's the second sort of piece of AI. The third piece is, how do I describe that work in a way that a client will pay? Someone told me that a narrative in a bill is really marketing for, here's why you should pay this $100,000 sort of line item. And then the last piece is, oftentimes these industries are asked to code their work so people understand budgets and understand where in the case or where in the project this work is occurring. There's other things that we do around, obviously, AI anonymization to make sure that data privacy and security are all hit, and we're starting to explore outlier detection. But for now, let's say those are the customer pain points that we solve with AI. The beauty of, as soon as the AI hysteria hit, probably November of last year, is that we just got to ask ourselves, hey, does this allow us to do this better and cheaper? And if the answer was no, we get to keep building what we've been building. And if the answer was yes, we get to leverage that open source tooling. And when you think about summarizing your work, this is an excellent use case for an LLM. And then not only do we get to leverage these LLMs to create that summary, but then we get to layer our own fine tuning on top of it to then turn that into something that we know will get paid. And so that's really how we explored all this technology, which is, hey, on the vectorization side for clustering or grouping, this like initial, are there other open source models that we can use? Great, let's use those because that helps us solve the customer point faster and cheaper. For some of the models, it didn't make sense to use anything open source because none of their data was particularly interesting, and our models were outperforming anything that we could do open source. So that was the mental model that we used, right? Can we solve this customer pain point faster and cheaper with the tools now available? And in some instances, the answer was definitively yes, and in some, the answer was no.
So you mentioned better, faster, cheaper. Was there any entirely new use cases that it unlocked?
The case that we had not contemplated is we had always thought about, okay, how do I create a narrative for work? And a narrative is really something that the end client sees in order to determine whether they want to pay this or not. What the LLM sort of piece did for us is actually, this is a really good way to summarize work to then remind a user what it is that they did across these fragments. We call this like a cluster description, but it doesn't matter what the name is. What matters is a use case is, hey, what are some natural language words that we could throw back at a user to refresh them as, oh, that's exactly what I was doing when I was working on it. So that was a really good use case in terms of what was possible. And then we really took a step function leap in terms of making sure that not only are we capturing every minute that you're working, but we are able to tune our algorithms now with the sort of the fine tuning aspect of making sure that it's going to get paid by the client. So clients will have these things called guidelines, or it's called OCGs. And these are basically rules that a client will say, hey, this is how I want the output of the time entry to look in order to pay it. And what a client is really saying there is, I don't trust you, lawyer or accountant, to do your time accurately. And so I'm going to impose a bunch of these arbitrary rules on you to make sure that you are paying attention when you're billing me hundreds of thousands of dollars. These can be as silly as, I want Haroon's name to be shortened to capital H period, or hey, don't use these words, or hey, I want this sort of active tense and when you write the narrative. It's not that Haroon actually cares, but this is a check and balance because you know that right now time is being done inaccurately and you want to make sure that you have some mechanism in place to hold those people accountable. And what's great for us is that we now get to use a lot of these LLMs and other pieces to tune these rules into the algorithm itself and making sure that the output is consistent with the way that people will pay. Yeah, most of it was, I would say, progressing our ability to deliver on what we've wanted to in a really an order of magnitude type way than we were able to previously. But the use cases were ones that we had been contemplated for a while because they're really the ones that customers had pain points around.
That makes sense. So text classification being some use case around that being obviously very well handled with generative AI. Comparing it to classification, which you may have been using traditional ML for, have you found generative AI to excel or match the performance of classification models or maybe some reasoning applications outside of text generation?
Right now, internally, the answer is no. Our classification models, because they're so client specific, because each customer, as you can imagine, has a very particular nomenclature around who they are billing for. We've built these models in-house on a per client basis, and those are still outperforming anything that would be open source in a more global approach. But as you mentioned, obviously the text generation and that piece of it, certainly you saw a big leap in terms of the readability and what we call releasability of what these descriptions and narratives look like.
And in terms of working with traditional ML and working with generative AI, let's focus on the text generation piece specifically. How similar are the two, working with traditional ML versus AI? And if you don't mind elaborating on some of the differences there as well, that would be really helpful.
The similarities are how you deploy it and validate it, right? And that's really the key. And so what you're using for model management and deployment, what you're using for your data pipelines orchestration. And then the key is how are you getting the feedback loop to make sure that those models are performing at a rate that you feel comfortable deploying. And so all that is very similar, independent of the ML approach that you take, whether it's GenAI or otherwise. I would say the difference is your traditional ML models have more of a direct output that you are more comfortable in. In other words, it's more of an input-output, large data pattern recognition. Whereas the GenAI models, obviously, depending on how you prompt it, depending on one word difference here or there, the output could be very different. And so GenAI is a bit of a very captivating technology because the 0 to 1 demos are incredible. You literally, from a zero-shot approach, can have really high efficacy of what the outputs are when you control what those input variables are. But then when it does get into production and you do get users and your thousands of users are prompting it in slightly different ways and you're getting 1,000 different responses, that can be a suboptimal client experience. And so there, I think the real key is making sure that you are limiting the scope of output as much as possible to deliver the customer outcome that you want to deliver it on. And for us, it's very simple, which is how do we make sure that this time entry gets paid?
Very well put. I think the way you described the difference between ML and GenAI in particular was excellent. And ML being more of the expert in pattern recognition, and then GenAI having more of those creative abilities. But flip side of that coin is that if you're looking to control for the user experience, prevent hallucinations, prevent issues with that AI interacting with other parts of your code base, you need to add some guardrails. And what types of guardrails are you adding at Laurel in order to make sure the application works as expected? And additionally, how do you know that you're not necessarily curtailing the creativity of those models as well in instances where you might deem that is something that you're looking to optimize?
Yeah, so one of the benefits of the industries that we operate in is a lot of these guardrails already exist. So as I mentioned, a lot of these guardrails are actually put on our customers by their clients. And so what we get to do is we get to programmatically put those guidelines or those rules into what we're outputting to make sure that the output is consistent with their constituency, which is the person paying the bills. So that's one piece of it. The biggest guardrail that we put in place, well, two really. One is we have thought a lot about confidence thresholds. And what we've learned is it is better to not make a prediction than make an incorrect prediction. And so a user is comfortable saying, hey, I understand why the machine was confused about this. So it's going to ask me to do something. What they are uncomfortable with is when the machine is doing something on their behalf that's incorrect, because that has real downstream implications. The third thing that we are very lucky in is, and this is, I think, a big difference between kind of what we're doing and some of the people that are attempting to do work on behalf of knowledge workers. Our human is very much in the loop. So what we specifically educate our users on is, hey, this is our best attempt at approximating your day, but it is your ethical obligation to review this, to change anything that you need, to add any of the brushstrokes, and then validate what you put into the firm's billing system. Now, the beauty for us is, from a selfish AI perspective, is that this is the best data labeling that you can imagine. I like to think of all of our users as just these like data Turks that are just telling us, hey, this is right, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. It's just phenomenal. And this is, again, the network effect of what we are doing. But it's very critical because some users, they've told us, they said, oh, I thought this was just going to do my time on my behalf to the point where I did not have to engage with what the outputs are. And the answer is we eventually will get there, but we are not there yet. And so we allow you to do this workflow easier and better, but it is still up to you to put that in. So that's on the guardrail side. So client enforced rules, confidence thresholds, and human in the loop. On the creativity side, the other nice thing about what we're doing today is I don't want to bring creativity to a timesheet. I just want it to get paid. No one's going to submit this for a Pulitzer. Here's this beautiful timesheet that's been so. What matters is that it gets to the client in a way that is fast, that is compliant, and that is accurate. And so it gets paid. And so actually, I would say inhibiting creativity is a feature and not a bug of what we are trying to do. And then as we have enough of a data set that we are creating to understand what work looks like, then that's when we'll start to want to layer on the more creative aspects of what we're doing.
Got it. That totally makes sense. And you mentioned this flywheel that you're creating with your users labeling those data sets as well. Are you feeding that back into your configuration for GenAI? And I'm curious, are you feeding that back in the form of fine-tuning, maybe iterating on prompts? Is it prompt engineering? What exactly is the mechanism that is being fed back into the GenAI application?
Yeah, it's using all of it as reinforcement learning. And I'll give you one sort of concrete example that's my favorite one. Right now, a lot of our customers' clients have something called e-billing solutions. And this is software that looks to programmatically accept or reject bills based on rules that they have tuned it with. Our system is able, in the billing system, to understand whether our entry was rejected by that e-billing provider or accepted by that e-billing provider. Based on that input, we then use that as positive or negative reinforcement to tell our system, hey, keep doing this because this got through, or this did not get through, intuit why, and then make sure it doesn't happen again. So this is the beautiful sort of poetic loop of what we are doing. Every time a user changes something, the user is saying, hey, system, you got it wrong. System says, great, I'm going to learn that. Every time a user takes a manual action, the system says, hey, I didn't realize that's where it belonged. I'm going to learn that. And so we've been branding this the co-pilot of time for that very reason, which is it's looking at everything that you're doing, everything that the client is paying or not paying, and using all that as reinforcement learning for the next time that it looks to create your timesheet.
Very interesting. So you're doing RLHF, and that's something that we don't hear too often. A lot of people talk about it, but not a lot of people are implementing it into their products. So very cool to hear about an example in the wild.
Our company here that we admire the most is Google, right? Every time that you search something, the model is updating. Now, of course, the infrastructure there is, to me, their moat, but that is the eventually where we want to get to. Every time a singular user takes an action, the model is updating and deploying.
Got it. Classic optimizing a recommendation engine type workflow. It seems very similar to that. And how do you see the use of specifically generative AI, since that's the focus of the show, increasing in Laurel over time? So what are the areas that you think they're going to be used in the future, and keeping your vision in mind of just making it much more efficient, the process of timekeeping and helping folks win back their time and spend their time on the highest impact tasks at hand? How does GenAI play a role in this in the future of Laurel? And maybe there's stuff on your roadmap that you want to share, maybe there's stuff that's not, but even the general strategy or your vision for that would be helpful.
Yeah, so I think of the company in 3 phases. Phase 1 is proving that a machine can do time better than a human. And our go-to-market strategy is apply that to industries in which keeping time is a compulsory workflow to make money. Very high promoting pressure there. So that's phase 1. Phase 2, to get to where we're going, is to say, great, we know when a machine creates time, it is, again, more structured, more accurate, and you're able to aggregate it. So the use case there is, how do we move professional services away from billing time and towards selling outcomes? Because my belief is that no human should be incentivized to send an email or call somebody. They should only be incentivized to deliver high value and efficient outcomes. I think this is the piece that a lot of people are missing about applying GenAI to professional services, which is until you rewire the incentive system, there is unfortunately too much friction to outsource work to a machine when the fundamental business model is built on human capital. But our time data set should say, we now know what work looks like across the industry. We're going to move from this time and materials model to a flat fee model because we have enough data to confidently place how much something should cost within some standard deviation, and there's going to be a lot of sort of complexity around the edge cases there. Then, and only then, do I believe that GenAI will hit true product market fit in professional services. And when that happens, we have the work data set on which our AI is running. We're going to say, great, here is where people are spending their time. Let's start to automate those workflows. And oh, by the way, here's this very large corpus of data in terms of what those workflows look like. And so whether we are building the tools internally or we're providing the data for someone else to build those tools, that is how I think Laurel can become a platform and enable this idea that we're going to rewire 20% of US GDP by saying, hey, knowledge workers no longer focus on selling time, but focus on selling value. And here are machines to help you do your work faster.
I see. In terms of the specific features that are going to be rolled out as you work towards that mission, what's on the roadmap that you're able to disclose, of course, regarding more of a prescriptive approach to managing your time?
There are a couple of elements. One is a user-facing element, which is, okay, you have my time. Now help me understand where I'm creating leverage and I'm not. Sort of, we call this time insights. This will allow you to understand, hey, how much time am I spending with clients and how much time am I spending internally? How much time am I spending on email and how much time am I spending on meetings? How much time am I spending creating sort of differentiated work and how much am I doing handling admin things? So this will start to help people understand their time in a way that they aren't thinking about today. So that's sort of the time insights piece. That's a user-focused piece. Then there's the firm insights piece, which is to say, what is my organization? How are they spending their time? And what are the real areas that we can create efficiency around? And these are things that we're sort of exploring now, which is like, all right, here's a non-billable action. 15% of our users are doing it. How do we either ask them to stop doing it or how do we automate that? Or, hey, what is the type of work that is actually creating margin and profitability and what is not? Hey, what is the actual utilization of my most expensive asset, which is people? So that's the sort of firm insights. Both are data visualization tools that we will build, but the audience is very different. One is a user engaging with their own time, and then a firm is engaging with their organization's time. So that's the next pieces that we are really excited to start breaking ground on.
So for your customers and prospects and folks in these legal firms, there's also this challenge of navigating the hurdles of adopting AI into particular workflows. What's that balance look like in managing the stakeholder expectations while pitching this idea of automating stuff that is mundane and maybe is a waste of time using a tool like Laurel?
In the enterprise, what you just asked is the single most important question. I tell this to prospects all the time. Our biggest competition isn't the incumbent, it is change management. Particularly in industries like law and accounting and consulting, people have been wedded to their workflows for decades, and it can be very difficult to unanchor them from the way they used to do things. The key that we have developed is two things. One, you have to make the system configurable. A user has to feel like they are crafting their own automation experience. And that might mean, by the way, that they don't leverage the automation at all. So what we get to do is we get to go to a firm and say, Laurel is a very agile system. And so no matter how your users are timekeeping today, they are able to replicate that workflow in Laurel. But if you want the power of the automation, the AI, here are areas you could opt into. And the more you opt into, the more money you're going to make as a firm. So that's a very critical piece. The second critical piece is being very data-driven in terms of how you approach change management. What we did is we would take a very data-driven sort of partnership process where we analyze their billing data across 30 metrics that we have created. And we said, hey, this cohort, this initial 500 user cohort, we believe are going to get you the highest ROI and going to give you the best qualitative feedback. And we're going to win with that group. And then we're going to use that as a Trojan horse to now start rolling out to the rest of the global organization. And so the key is making sure that you find those early champions, because that peer virality is so critical in terms of getting adoption and rollout to happen at a company. Because no matter what I say, at the end of the day, those professionals are going to want to hear from their peers and their managers, and making them successful is really the key to rolling out.
So Ryan, what are you most looking forward to in regards to the future of Laurel, in regards to the future of GenAI in general, and the journey towards this mission of helping people make more of their time?
Yeah, I think the thing about Laurel that I get most excited about, I'm a big believer, again, in, Munger says, follow the incentive, I'll show you the behavior. And so what I'm most excited about for Laurel is to rewire the incentive model for professional services. Because by doing so, we will create true product market fit for GenAI tools. And I believe that we are in inning one on what the efficacy of these GenAI tools, and I'm very bullish in terms of the type of work that they will be able to do. And my belief is that within 5 years, you'll need about 20 to 30% of the professionals that we have doing the work today, so long as the incentive model actually supports that. And I think what I get so excited about GenAI isn't the technology itself, but what it will allow professionals to do is focus on that top decile creativity that will be a very long tail for AI to get to. And I think that these are some of our brightest minds in society, and 70 to 80% of what they do today are undifferentiated work in order to get to the differentiated work. And so now machines get to wipe that crud off and say, hey, really sharp person, spend all your time focusing on this 20%. And I think that is really exciting. And I think that those people are actually worth a lot more in society. So people will say, oh, it's crazy that I pay a lawyer $1,000 an hour. It's only crazy because they have to do 100 hours of work to get to the place where they're even worth that. But if you're in a high stakes litigation, it's worth $30 billion, and there's a person that's going to create a differentiated outcome based on their creativity, I believe that person will be paid a lot more money in that Gen AI world. So that piece gets me really excited, because I think that humans are just designed for creativity, designed for critical thinking. I do believe that the AI will get there, but I think that we are further away from that piece, and it's just going to really empower humans to do the things that we are uniquely suited to do.
And this segues well into my next question, which is, what is your hottest take that's related to AI? So your most contrarian take.
I don't know if this is contrarian. I find the LLM funding to be fascinating, and really it's just one giant OpEx funding. The idea of Microsoft and Amazon and Google investing into AI companies and then making them use their cloud to do the computing. There's a great Aziz Ansari joke about going out to the club with Jay-Z while he's drinking his own vodka, signing the bill, and it goes back into his pocket. It just feels like that's what's going on here. And so I don't personally see where the differentiated value are going to come from these platforms. My guess is that there'll be 5 or 6, for all intents and purposes, similar outcomes. And so the sort of what you can charge are going to be on the lower scale. I think AI companies that create revenue are going to be the ones that are very successful. That is a very trite thing to say, but I think in any sort of hype cycle, you can lose focus on the fundamentals. And so I don't think that AI companies, because they're AI companies, will be successful. I think they will be successful because they're solving really large customer problems with AI as a mechanism of doing so.
Completely makes sense. It's a common thing that we've heard with other guests on the show as well. So it's a very common belief and one that I agree with as well. And to wrap up here, Ryan, where can folks learn more about Laurel and all the amazing stuff that your team is building? And where can folks find you on the web?
Yes, go to laurel.ai. Check us out there. For all of you listening, if what we're doing is interesting, we are always hiring. If you want to work on time as a problem set and you want to work on empowering knowledge workers to do more and less, reach out. You can find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn. If you want to email me directly, ryan@laurel.ai.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining, Ryan.
Thank you very much.